my background is in politics. Back in 2014, when the UN were negotiating sort of the new global framework to replace the Millennium Development Goals, I was at the time a government minister in Denmark. I was the Minister for Environment. So I was part of the team of the government of Denmark that traveled around the world talking to my peers and my colleagues from other countries, of course, talking about the Danish government's priorities in these negotiations that were taking place at the UN. And at the time, I was getting increasingly encouraged to see the process that the UN had launched for this, because we had seen many times before that, UN negotiations, it very much happens in New York with the governments negotiating with each other. But for the first time, we actually saw a very intense, UN really tried to open up this process to have what they called an open working group that would collect inputs from all over the world, from civil society, from private sector, from academia, from every citizen who wanted to contribute. They made an effort to make sure that everyone had a chance to be involved in that process. So this was historically, this had never been done before, to come up with this new set of goals to replace the Millennium Development Goals. And what we saw also for the first time was that there was kind of an acknowledgement that we could no longer have two parallel tracks with environment and climate in a sidetracked from economic and social development. So Millennium Development Goals were very much focused on sort of the traditional development issues, economic and social development. There were 8 Millennium Development Goals, and now we were talking about a much larger and much more complex set of goals that would integrate for the first time the climate and environment dimension into the total set of global goals, which was, of course, groundbreaking, because it meant that it would no longer be possible to discuss issues of poverty and hunger and education and health without also looking at how this is intertwined with the increasing challenges that the world is facing with climate and environmental issues. So this acknowledgement was really what, in my view, of course, also being a Minister of Environment, was critical to making sure that we would actually have a possibility to be successful with achieving a world in harmony, a world in balance, both with the global north and the global south, but also a planet in balance. This is crucial to understand how groundbreaking the 2030 agenda really is, because that is what makes it much more holistic and also much more, our chances for success are bigger because we have this acknowledgement as the basis of it. On your screen now, hopefully you have the 17 SDGs in front of you. Hopefully you've all seen these before. The goals have, with this visual platform that has been developed actually by a Swedish guy named Jakob Trollbäck. He developed all these beautiful icons that now symbolize the 17 goals that, most of us now are familiar with these. And to me, this has been a very important aspect of the goals, that we have this visual identity for the goals. I think this is really, whether you like it or not, people need something that they can recognize. And I believe that these icons are very much part of the success of the SDGs, that we now have them to accompany our conversation around sustainable development. When we were negotiating the goals, I remember that many of my colleagues were saying, the Open Working Group presented 17 goals. This is way too many goals. No one will ever remember 17. The Millennium Development Goals, we had 8. No one really remembers them. How is it going to be when we have 17? But I really think that with this visual kind of identity, we have actually made it possible to have some sort of way to remember these goals. And I think this is actually really important. So we have 17. We have all 3 dimensions of sustainability in one set of goals. Economic, social, and environmental sustainability are all part of this set of goals. So we have 17 goals, but we also have, in each of the 17 goals, we have a number of targets. And this is what this poster shows you. And Jakob Trollberg now also developed an icon for each of the 169 targets. So you can have also a visual identity for each of the targets. So if any one of you are already working with this framework, you may already be familiar with, which targets are most relevant for your work. And you may already be familiar with these icons to kind of present the priorities that you have made. Otherwise, I would strongly recommend it. I'll come back to that. But just to say that, yes, we have 17 goals, but we also have 169 targets, which is really where we can be more familiar with the whole complexity of the framework, and also take a little bit more deep dive into, so what is it actually that we're supposed to be doing? The targets will tell you more about what exactly does it mean when we say consumption and sustainable consumption and production. What does that mean? SDG number 12. Then you can see the targets. All right, this is what we have to achieve before 2030. On top of that, we also have 232 indicators. So for each target, there's also a specific indicator. I'll come back to that, but that's just to tell you that there are several layers in this complex set of goals. So I always recommend, if you want to know what world leaders were actually saying when they adopted the 2030 agenda, read the declaration. It's really interesting to read the declaration. Normally, maybe you think this is really boring, but this is actually, when I'm really depressed, I read this slide, because it says how ambitious our leaders were when they adopted this agenda. This is for the first time in the history of the UN that we have a universal agenda for sustainable development, 3 dimensions of sustainability in one. And this says that this is not anymore just a development agenda. Before the Millennium Development Goals, countries like mine, developed countries could say, okay, so we will increase, or we will do this with our development aid, international cooperation, then that's fine. We don't have to change anything ourselves. But, this changed that completely, because now all countries and all stakeholders will implement this plan. This is what it says. So every country must integrate this in their policy planning. They must have action plans that tell how we are going to change to contribute to the transformation of our world. The headline of the declaration, I should have put that in there, is actually transforming our world. So it's not just, a little bit of change. It's actually a transformation, which is very ambitious. Then it also says that the goals and the targets are all integrated and indivisible. Indivisible means you cannot just cherry pick. You have to look at the complex set of goals. You have to look at the way that they are interconnected. So this is also, it's a big task. It's a huge challenge, but it's also really important, because as I said, this is where it gets complex, yes, but this is also what increases our chances of actually achieving sustainable development. And then it says that all governments must also develop their own national targets. So it's not enough just to look at the global indicator framework. You have to also look at what kind of targets would we want to measure our progress in our country. So this is something that is not happening to a large extent. Some countries have done it, but it's, still we have a long way to go with it. And then there are lastly, two really important principles behind SDGs, which will be really relevant, I guess, for many of you, because especially in a development context, leaving no one behind. And I'm sure if you're familiar with the agenda, you already know that this is like basic principle. Leaving no one behind means that in our efforts to implement the 2030 agenda, we should always look at the 40% of our populations that are least likely to achieve the goal. So we have to look at the more vulnerable groups first. And this is how we should prioritize our efforts. So leaving no one behind is extremely important to have in mind when you start to implement this. Do no harm is where you will find kind of the human rights basis of it all. If you look at the 17 goals, you'll see that there's no specific goal for human rights. That does not mean that we don't need human rights as the basis for everything we do. And that is what the do no harm principle really expresses, is that you must always start from the principles of human rights when you start to look at how to implement SDGs.